While I recognize that this talk may make some feel uncomfortable, that is not my intention. I am simply here to give recognition to factual occurrences that have shaped America and its dance forms. I am honored to do this, and I'm very privileged to be here. And I'm simply here to educate. Growing up in the African American community, I had often heard not much about African Americans' contribution to American society. Sure, I heard about things like the civil rights movement, jazz music, blues music, hairstyles, and fashions of today, but not much beyond that point. Sure, there were members of my family who had said that there were a lot of contributions that African Americans had made to American society, but they were simply just not being highlighted. Not learning about these things until later on in life, honestly, leaves me feeling a little robbed. And I can only imagine that that is how a lot of African Americans have felt for the longest time. Take, for instance, something I learned later on. In 1923, Garrett Morgan, a black man, invented the three-light traffic signal with only an elementary school education. There was a study done in 2017 by Seth Gershon, Constance Lindsay, Melissa Hart, and Nicholas Papageorge. And this study spanned over 7 to 10 years. And during that study, they found that if you had just one black teacher in a 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade class, that the likelihood of a black boy from a low-income neighborhood dropping out of school later decreased by 39%. They also found that if black boys and black girls had teachers who looked like them in the school system, in their schools, that they had the greater expectation of going to high school, of going to college later on in life. I want to talk about the impact of having people around you who look like you, but before I get into that, my favorite part of my talk is the Africanist Aesthetic. These were developed by Dr. Robert Ferris Thompson in his book, The Flash of the Spirit. The first one, my professor Danielle Sheether is going to present, and it is polyrhythm and high effect juxtaposition. Sweet. So as you heard and saw, polyrhythm is when the dynamic changes. That can be speed, anything. And then she also demonstrated high effect juxtaposition. And high effect juxtaposition also means that it gets louder and it gets softer. The next one I want to talk about is polycentrism, or the change of direction. Yeah. As my classmate Eli demonstrated, he had multiple movements coming out from the central axis of his body, and he also used gravity to change the direction and momentum and where he was going with intent. The next one I want to talk about is embracing the conflict and ephebism. Yeah. Can you tell that this is my favorite part of my whole talk? I just love it. If I could just sit here and watch them do it all day, I totally would. But back to my talk. So, embracing the conflict, as you saw, was just having joy in the circumstance that the people are enduring. And then the second one, ephebism, is also means the exuberance or the attack of youth because it simply has power, vitality, flexibility, drive, things like that. An asset of youth, if you will. The last one I want to talk about is the aesthetic of cool. Yeah. I also want to recognize that while I am also talking about the Africanist aesthetic in dance, I know that I have white and a Latina dancer here, but I just want to recognize that I also live in the state of Utah, and the likelihood of diversity is like very slim, so bear with me. But this is important to research, especially in terms of dance. Because as Baba Chuck Davis once said, to understand the culture, study the dance, and to understand the dance, study the people. This is essential because far too often, when dances or anything, art, are distributed between cultures as cultural currency, it is very unlikely that sometimes these ideas get lost in translation to who developed them first, and credit isn't given where credit is due. I just want to bring up one quote that I love, and it's by Joaquin Piper. And he once said, "History is always written by the victor, and the histories of the vanquished belong to a shrinking circle of those who were there." Throughout the 17th and 18th century, Africans are stolen and put onto ships to be sold in America. During their time on these ships, they were not only there to be sold, but they were also there to be exorcised. One of the primary sources that I found was Dr. Thomas Trotter, who in 1783 was a surgeon of the Brooks, and he said, quote, "Dancing the slaves was a regular activity. Usually, several crew members paraded on deck with whips and cat-o'-nine tails, foxing the men slaves to jump in their irons, often until their ankles bled." Also, in the book that I read in preparation for this research, Dancing Under the Lash, Mr. Thomas Clarkson said, "After meals, they jumped their irons for exercise." When they arrived on what is now U.S. soil, they worked from dawn until dusk, or as the enslaved called it, from black to black, on the plantations of their enslavers. However, it is important to understand that the enslaved people were forcibly brought from various parts of predominantly West Africa. And just because they came from predominantly West Africa, it didn't mean that they spoke the same language. So they had to develop new ways to communicate. Due to the Stonewall Rebellion, which led to the Negro Act of 1740, the enslaved were prohibited from dancing their dances, doing their songs, and their religious practices. So, the dance and music of their homelands, of the enslaved, were developed in a different way so that they could practice them in secret. This coupled with the difficulties of language, created some of the foundations for what we see today in American dance. Other acts that further oppressed the enslaved include the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Black Code of 1865, and the Code Noir from 1685 from King Louis XIV. The Charleston can also be discussed in this topic, but for the lack of time, I just want to focus on a couple. So the first dance I want to focus on is the ring shout. This dance was danced in a circle. The participants stomped their feet, they sung, they clapped their hands, and this was often accompanied by percussive music. The next one that they had was the juba. They stomped their feet, they patted and slapped their arms, their legs, their chests, their cheeks, and patter breaks were developed to communicate. The cakewalk was a partner dance, and the enslaved danced in an upright stance. This was danced for their enslavers, and the enslavers didn't really know that they were being mocked by the enslaved, but they did it anyway. And both the cakewalk and the juba were accompanied by ragtime music. The last dance I want to highlight is dancing the Big Apple. But before I do that, the dances that I mentioned earlier have elements of the Africanist aesthetic and were performed in the solace of each other's company or for their masters. And because their only job was to do as they were told and nothing more, because they were seen as property, as commodities that could be easily replaced, this is where we see the power imbalance today, which carries over into systemic racism today, things like that. But the African slaves, even though they were seen as commodity and they weren't their own person, they still persevered. And that is something that I'm very proud to say. Fast forward to the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves weren't even free until after that, June 19th, 1865, which is why we now have Juneteenth. After this time, due to the lack of generational wealth, they had nowhere to go. Some of them stayed on plantations, and some of them migrated up north. One thing in specific I want to talk about is the Great Migration. This started in 1917, and it didn't end until 1970. During this time, there was something called the Harlem Renaissance, or the Black Renaissance, the Black Mecca and the center of rebirth of Black culture. This is where new ideas were explored from members of the Black community. There were new ideas, new dances, new songs, new practices. But during the Great Migration, there was also something else that happened, and it was the Great Depression. The economic downturn that not only had an effect on American society as a whole, but also the Black community. During this time, there are lots of people looking for escape, which is a natural human thing to do. But during this time, there was a dance developed called the Big Apple. And when you hear the Big Apple, you normally think, oh, New York. While that is true, it is also a dance. And in this dance, they are mimicking farm animals. This dance was started down south, and once the Great Migration happened, it migrated up north with the African Americans who performed it. There's one story in particular that I want to talk about. Fat Sam, an African American, was once in a church with other Black African Americans dancing this dance. And there was a group of white teenagers, including Bill Spivey and his friends, that came up, and they were fascinated by what they heard and what they saw. Fat Sam, knowing about the segregation laws against him, and millions of African Americans around this world, he said that they could only watch if they watched from the balcony. They watched it and they loved it. Night after night, they came back and more teenagers came. And after what they saw, they continued to practice it. Not often the same way that they saw it, but they practiced it. So this dance has two different sides of the story. It has the original creators who developed it, and has people who saw it and mimicked it. Black troops performed it, white troops performed it, so it has two different sides of the story. I think that this is an essential part of where fascinization and fetishizing over cultures comes from, especially in terms of African Americans. Because, I mean, we cool, yo. But I think this is where fascinization and fetishizing comes from. Well, yeah. One modern day example that I do want to talk about is Jalila Harmon. She's a Black creator on TikTok who created, as a lot of you Gen Z people will know, the Renegade. She created the Renegade, but there are mainstream white creators who were invited onto mainstream shows to perform this dance before she was ever allowed to, or ever asked to. This is just another example of the power imbalance that we see today. Also, one thing that I discovered while I was researching this topic, Ziggy Tyler, another Black creator, researched in the marketplace of TikTok. Things that he typed in the marketplace were Black voices, Black success, Black Lives Matter. And when he did that, the algorithm flagged as a threat. But when he searched things like white voices, white supremacy, the algorithm didn't flag it as a threat. And this is the power imbalance that we see today, and also that the media is biased. As I educate myself on my culture, on other cultures, I feel that I'm coming to do as Baba Chuck Davis once said. By educating ourselves on other cultures and their dances, we are being connected, and we are beginning the long road towards reparations, healing. And I just want to leave a message to Black and brown girls around the world, and Black and brown boys. You can contribute so much to society. No matter what anyone says, You matter. You can do it. So if you don't know where a dance comes from, instead of blindly participating, ask, do your research, and consider how ahistorical narratives have perpetuated appropriation over centuries. Thank you.